and who did his studies in Denmark and Copenhagen and South also University in psychology and religion, and then did his PhD in psychology, and I think already in the field of educational psychology and game psychology. He's also a game designer and worked in that field, and has now assistant professorship at the DPU, which is the pedagogical university in Denmark, and for educational psychology, and looking forward to your talk.
Sure. So we can see you party hardest yesterday, I guess. So yeah, my name is Andreas, and I'm here at Interacting Minds with Kat and with the other Andreas. Sometimes I'm called he's called the big Andreas, and I'm called the little Andreas, which is weird because it's like yay high. But still, I've been here for quite a while, and the center that we're at, as you've probably gathered by now, is like a very mixed methods, mixed field endeavor. We're trying to really enhance conversation between different people working in different fields, asking questions of different subject matters, from reading and literature. We have made it from archaeology, psychology of learning in games is what I'm doing. Lots of anthropologists, lots of psychologists, lots of neuroscientists, and lots of methods in that field as well. So we're really trying to just learn a lot from each other and figuring out. So on one hand, we all come to this space with different questions, with different interests that we're curious about how to tease apart empirically, but also we come with a willingness to kind of learn and adapt methods from each other. So I kind of view this place as an ongoing conversation between different interesting questions and different methods that some master and some of us are just starting to get into. Another role that I've realized that we have ever since kind of play in games has become high on our agenda is that we're pretty good at consulting with non-academics, or and with academics who come from fields or cultures at the Danish universities where there is not a strong empirical tradition. We have a lot of very, very talented theoretical researchers who have never done any field work in their lives, perhaps beyond casual observation. And they come to us to kind of open that conversation and see, so what could we do? What are our options in trying to get wiser about the subject matter that we're investigating? And I've been spending a lot of time recently talking to people from industry as well, with academics working with industry in games and teaching design. And the question that I get over and over again is, can you help us measure motivation? Can you help us measure fun? Is what we're doing right? Does it work? And a lot of the time, that's a really interesting conversation, because we find out that when people design games for learning, or any kind of engaging media for learning, what they often have as kind of their tacit theory is that if this is engaging enough, if this is fun enough, then learning will magically ensue. That's going to be the consequence of the fun and the engagement. And what I've learned, starting pretty much from the same point of departure, is that that's definitely not always the case. Often you'll have people who are having a bunch of fun, but have a very hard time saying, so what did they learn from it, or having a hard time figuring out how what they just experienced actually pertains to the learning trajectories that they're on at the moment. So that's sort of one of the very pragmatic conversations that we have all over and over again. But I've been working within the intrinsic motivation framework. And just kind of to read the room, how many of you guys have kind of a medium understanding of the intrinsic motivation theory literature? Okay, so a bunch of you know about it, a bunch of you are nonsense. That's fine. So I'm going to start pretty close to the ground, and I apologize to the ones of you who are already advanced. This is probably going to be a little more low level, but you're very welcome to ask questions both at any kind of level in this conversation. So just to kind of show you one of the methods that we use and that we often suggest as a point of departure for studying games in learning or media for any other practical reason, actually. I'm just going to show you a study to give you an idea of how this can unfold. Then I'm going to dive into this whole intrinsic motivation thing from a more theoretical perspective. Show you a couple of the tools that we use and the stuff that we always say, okay, we can always do this. This is probably going to be pretty easy. And then I'm going to go into some pragmatic reflections from a mixed methods perspective, because that's kind of my approach to things these days. Trying to figure out how can we make qualitative and quantitative or ethnographic and more hard controlled numbery measures fit together in a grander explanation of a practice field. So one of the, I've already said a lot about the different things that I do, but one of the sort of discourses that I'm deeply engaged in right now is gamification. How many of you guys have stumbled on that? So just a couple of you, okay. So gamification is basically the idea of making something into a game in some way. I've kind of, doing discourse analysis, I figured out that there are two views of what gamification is. On one hand, you have like a common sense or a very broad definition that says that's doing something with games. So if I were to bring in a game of Sorry or Ludo, as it's called in Denmark, and have you play that game just in this room, kind of as a team building exercise, just to have fun together with the object of just creating a nice social space, then that would be gamification of the space. On the other hand, there is a more kind of traditional or academic definition, which is adding game elements to non-game contexts. So it's not necessarily about using real games or creating full game experiences, but more about kind of leveraging the psychological mechanisms that seem to work well in games to see if you can motivate people to do other things, like keep kids engaged in a learning trajectory over time, or have support runners when they both on individual kind of jogs and over time, so they get back on the horse and remember to do the next run. So you can use these kinds of game elements in many different contexts. And the prevailing idea there is that if you add some game stuff, then fun is going to happen, and fun is going to lead to whatever behavioral outcome you're interested in. But what people are not very good at is, on one hand, dissociating the different kind of game elements that are used. So if you, on one hand, add a little story about, so now the reason why you're running is that this is actually a zombie apocalypse, and you're running from zombies. And the way that that's going to work is that if you don't run fast enough, you're going to hear zombies in your earphones on your phone, and if they catch you, you're going to lose a life. So that's kind of the core loop of the running experience. And on the other hand, you have a bunch of stuff that if you do your different runs, you can pick up different things that you're going to need to survive. So you can get guns and first aid kits and stuff like that. And all that seems very well and good, but people are generally not very good at figuring out. So if you take all these different things, which might be engaging in very different ways at different parts of this experience trajectory, how do they each contribute to kind of overall motivation or the overall behavioral outcomes that they're interested in? So what I've been doing, and what's kind of my deal internationally, is trying to tease apart those different game elements. So if you add a lot of different game things to a non-game context, how can we know what's actually making the difference here? Is that the points? Is that the zombie noises? Is that the picking up things that will help you from run to run, whatever? So that's kind of the conversation that I'm involved in generally. And the very first study I did with this is just something that I came up with during my PhD and kind of did as a side quest, I guess you'd say, was this. So one thing that I experienced a lot in that conversation about importing games into serious context would be that you'd have people who like games. Then everyone knows the experience of a good game. Everyone can think of, okay, I know good game experiences and I know bad game experiences, and I kind of know what a game looks like. And most people will, at least in Denmark, and I gather that it's pretty much the same in the US at least, people will often think about kind of the board games that they played as a kid, because every house had a board game. So what people often do is that they build a rudimentary board game for maybe coursework. So they say, okay, so we can take a quiz game like Trivial Pursuit or something like that, and we can add some questions, and then you roll the die, and when you hit a field on a game board, you'll have to answer a question, and that'll help spur conversation or whatever. But usually, also what I've noticed with these things is that people who aren't trained game designers, I have like a background with designing games, but people who've never tried this before really have no idea how to build a game that works very well. So often what you see is just something that looks rudimentarily like a game, but really doesn't have the feel of a real game. It doesn't create that engagement, that feeling of being together, solving a real problem, or competing about something that really matters to you. Even though you might not really care about the pawns moving around on a storyboard, if you're about to win and somebody overtakes you, you know the feeling of caring all of a sudden. So stuff that's not really important can make you care a lot if it's within kind of a game frame. So the thing that I was curious about, so how much is this actually just the framing? How much of this is just, you know, telling each other, we're going to play a game, this is going to be within kind of the gaming logic of having a conversation, of being together as human beings, and how much of this is going to be about the actual game mechanics that a lot of these people who just work in HR departments and decide to make a game for a workshop really don't know too much about building. So we did like a small, very simple control experiment where we created a board game. One of my game design colleagues helped me do the graphics and stuff like that for it. And I'm not going to tell you a lot about the game. The basic idea is that we had students discuss student environment issues. So every year we have evaluations of the university, and the psychology department where I was at the time had some different areas where they were kind of lagging behind the other departments. So we just kind of took all the areas where we knew that we were getting bad evaluations, and we put them on cards, and we said, so the game's going to be about discussing these things and coming up with interesting comments or solutions or stuff that can help the dean solve some of these problems. And then we kind of split those things up into three groups. So we had a control group. These guys were just given the questions. They weren't given any game stuff at all. They were giving the same questions that the other guys were given. And they were just asked to, one at a time, facilitate this discussion, pass this list of questions around. If it's Kat's turn, then she would read the question and say, okay, so what do we want to say about this? And then at the end of the thing, they just rated, so how important do you think this issue is on a scale of 1 to 5, and how important do you think your input for this is? So that would kind of be the basic task, like any evaluation you'd see on paper anywhere. And then we had two groups that we gave this nice looking game board and talked about the whole thing as a game. We said, okay, so we're going to play this evaluation game that's going to help you have a conversation about this stuff. And one group were given the questions on, they were both given the questions on cards, except one group was told that, so when it's your turn, you're going to move your pawn 1 space. And then you're going to read the question, facilitate the thing, and you're going to, and the group is going to decide on how important this issue was. The other group was told, when it's your turn, you're going to read the questions, you're going to do the star thing, and then the number of stars is going to determine how far your pawn is going to move. So being a good facilitator was seen as kind of a behavior contingent game mechanic. If you created a good discussion, if you were able to tease some interesting stuff out of your cohorts, then that would be what created kind of the game experience. So the idea was basically that you'd have something that was not a game at all, something that just had surface game features, and something that incorporated some of the things that theory says is important for a game experience, namely that when it's your turn you do something that's important, the outcome can go either way, and you're somewhat personally invested in kind of the overall state of the game over time, both when it's your turn and when it's not. So it's not a great game at all, but it's kind of trying to add some of the stuff that theory says is important to games. And what we found, and then we did the study, and this is why I'm telling you, I just want to illustrate sort of a way of going about measuring intrinsic motivation. So we did kind of the briefings. I don't know why it says 2 briefings there. So we gave them a color story telling that this is actually a tool that we're testing out. We might implement it at the university level in general. And the task, take the turns, facilitate the discussion and stuff. And then we started them out. And then after 30 minutes of play, we stopped them and said, okay, so this is actually how long we wanted to play, and we knew that people would usually, from testing, people would have had the chance to have like 3 or 4 turns in this context, maybe. Actually this is kind of it, but we still need the evaluation sheets that you need to fill out. So could you please just stay seated at your tables? You can do basically whatever you want, but you just need to wait around. I'm really sorry. And then the experimenter left. I didn't facilitate any of the groups. We had some guys doing that, which is called a false finish. Is anyone in here a pro wrestling fan? The false finish is in a pro wrestling match when you think that the match is over, but it's really not. Something happens to disturb the thing, and then excitement mounts because something else is going to happen. Somebody cheated their way out of losing or whatever. So the false finish is when you think it's over, but it's not. And then we waited for 20 minutes, and what the facilitators did was they noticed how long people actually kept on playing, and we noticed how many more questions they filled out in the meantime. Yeah. So we timed them and counted. And then at the actual finish, 20 minutes later, we gave them paper surveys to fill out. And then on one hand, we compared the surveys between the three groups, and on the other hand, we compared how productive they'd been and whether they actually kept on playing after the false finish, or whether they just said, okay, so the actual task is done, I'm going to take out my cell phone or whatever. And there is a methodological problem to this that some of you might respond already. But basically what we found is that the control group ranked lower on interest and engagement than the other two groups. But those two groups weren't really different at all. So they didn't rank differently on intrinsic motivation. They all said, okay, yeah, this was kind of a nice experience. We kind of liked it. That it was pretty cool. But they were equal, at least statistically. What we did find, however, is that, and this is like the proof of concept for the game design, is that we also had like just one question that says, so how much does this actually feel like a real game? And this group ranked significantly higher than the other groups on that. So the group that we claimed we were giving more game mechanics actually also experienced it as more gaming than the other groups. So what this finding is being used for in the gamification research is to say that oftentimes your mechanics might be very important to create sustained engagement and facilitate different kinds of motivation and stuff like that, but the surface features of the experience, kind of the social framing of the thing, is going to be pretty important to that as well. So that's kind of the nice newspaper story. The scientific story is a bit more clouded because the intrinsic motivation inventory that we used actually has a bunch of subscales. And the scale where the difference was found was the main one, the one called interest engagement, the one that's actually supposed to measure how fun was this, how engaging was this kind of on its own. The other scales were pretty much the same across the board. So that was did you feel like you were forced into this, or did you feel related to the people? Actually, you can see it's a board game. This is the relatedness measures. Everyone seemed to feel that it was like a worthwhile social experience. Actually, the game group, even though it's not significant, it's the lowest one of those, which is interesting. And in terms of behavior, we had a mix-up with some of the data. We simply lost data from a couple of the groups, so we can't say anything that for certain, but it doesn't look like there was a behavioral difference between the groups. What it does look like, if we were to look at the data just kind of from the top down more descriptively, is at least that the control groups seem to be the ones who were most active, the control groups playing the game, and they also produced a lot more answers. So they seem to be able to move on to the next kind of question, just pass on the paper and go about their business much quicker than the ones who had to spend time thinking about the game and moving pawns and figuring out the rules and stuff like that. So that's another thing that we figured out, that actually if we're just looking at productivity, then the games might actually not be any good for that. And so, okay, so what is that intrinsic motivation thing? I've kind of just flashed it before and say, so we have measures of fun, we have other measures, and so what's that about? So theoretically, intrinsic motivation emerged as a term in the 70s and 80s, kind of as a response in psychology to the dominant logics of inquiry at the time. So at this time, cognitive psychology, which was very, on the one hand, inspired by behaviorism and lab studies, and on the other hand, by computer science, was kind of in the ascendant. You also had you had basic conversations about, so why do people do things? It's the same, and that logic was the same kind of in society then as it is now, that people do so based on incentives. If you pay someone or you threaten them or whatever, what you want them to do, which is true, they will. And also behaviorism was pretty strong at the time. So this was really what this was a reaction to, because in terms of kind of rational choice theory, you do things if it's rewarding. If it's on a rational level, gives you something in return, you avoid punishment, but mainly you'll do it based on the pay that you get, which is kind of the politically right, economically liberal philosophy in general. Behaviorism kind of had the same idea, except that this was the study of learned associations, and an important part of that conversation, which the humanistic and the positive psychologists that came up with the intrinsic motivation idea read against, was that in behaviorism, you were not allowed to talk about the mind, you were not allowed to talk about experience. This is something that Skinner spent a lot of time being in a conversation about. You shouldn't ask people, because basically people don't know why they do things. Most of what we learn is pretty tacit. Most of it, we're much more behavior machines than anything else, and kind of the experience of motivation and the experience of doing something for one reason is usually, it might be accurate, but then again, it's probably not a worthwhile scientific inquiry, was the idea of behaviorism. And then there was a conversation with kind of psychiatry and psychoanalysis as well, where the views of humans and human motivations were pathological. It was mainly about looking at humans not when they were well, but when they were unwell. Human psychology, that was kind of the idea about psychology that they were attacking there. So what a bunch of different people were saying at the time, including kind of the heirs of Abraham Maslow, was that, but listen guys, it seems that when you kind of just look at your own life experience, if you look at animals, if you look at kids, if you look at human beings who are not at work doing something under the capitalist iron cage of Max Weber, then often you'll see that people do stuff that you can't really explain away with pay or with learned associations, anything like that. It seems that might be the root cause in some way, but a lot of what humans seem to do seems to come out of our own volition. It seems to come out of stuff like, this is fun, or it seemed like a good idea at the time, which is famous last words, of course. But a lot of motivations don't seem to be extrinsic, they seem to be intrinsic. They seem to be coming from the individual. So that was kind of the basic idea in this period of time. So when we look at kind of human life and human endeavor in general, we're going to see a lot of stuff that's extrinsically motivated. We're going to see a lot of stuff that fits the bill of doing things because of intrinsic motivators, because of learning, because of all those things. And learning is probably going to be somewhere in the middle. But we also see a lot of people who don't do things because they are being forced to pay to whatever. They do that for intrinsic reasons. They do that for their own reasons. So that's kind of the basic idea of intrinsic motivation, that humans do things because we want to, because we like to. And sometimes you can find a kind of a distant reason for that in evolutionary psychology or in personal history. That's kind of one of the approaches that's been taken to it, but at other times it's just interesting to see, so what makes people do things without the pay, and this is where kind of the gamification conversation comes into the picture, because many of the gamification people have been arguing that what they do is, by introducing game elements, instead of rewarding people with small fees, or saying you can be part of the prize draw or whatever, they introduce like intrinsic motives that will help people run. So you'd want to run because it's fun to run away from the zombies, because you think it's going to be interesting to see what's going to happen next and what kind of stuff you can gather up for your continued zombie survival adventure and stuff like that. So what a lot of gamification people are saying is that they're moving motives from extrinsic means to intrinsic means. But if you ask me, a lot of what's going on is actually very extrinsic, because a lot of it's also about kind of just creating symbolic rewards instead of monetary rewards. So it's often about saying, okay, so you brushed your teeth for 2 stars, but you didn't hit the 5-star mark. That's basically just really classic reinforcement, really classic extrinsic motivation. But there are some different theories in there, and so 2 of kind of the main voices in there are Malone and Weber and Hender Long, and they kind of created a scheme where they say, so intrinsic motivation can basically be parsed up into 2 different logics. On one hand, you have individual motivators, being challenged, kind of feeling that you're in control of your own experience. So it seems to be important that sometimes you like to do things better when it's of your own volition. You pick between work, which is something that's forced on you. You have papers to grade, but you also have the opportunity to play a video game or watch Game of Thrones or whatever for a while. And people will often say, okay, so I just kind of like the idea that I can pick this, and then that will be motivating in itself. And kind of the ongoing idea about free choice and being in control seems to be important. Being challenged as well. This is we talked about Csikszentmihalyi's flow idea. Flow is really kind of the sweet spot between boredom and anxiety, between challenge and skill. So you need to be challenged, but not in an overdue way. And behavioral economic studies seems to, and learning studies seems to really support this idea that if you challenge people, if you create competition, that can be extremely engaging and motivating, but it can also be very demotivating if it's not fair. So I think at one of the main military academies in the US, for instance, they tried to put the low achievers with high achievers because they thought that the high achievers would pull out the low achievers. But the end result of that was that the low achievers just fared even more abysmally because they just kind of clicked together and decided against competing with those guys where they couldn't compete. They never finished even near the middle of the class in that case. But a byproduct of that field experiment was that they took all the middle students and bunched those together in another group. And those guys raised each other up a lot in terms of performance and motivation because the competition that was going on there was actually fair. They actually had the opportunity to compete with someone that was close to their level. So challenge and the feeling of control, the feeling of actually being able to do something about it seems to be very important. Fantasy just being whisked away into interesting stories is something that people from guys like a lot of you guys studying movies should know more about than me. Curiosity, just figuring out, so what's this all about? How can we explore the game world or explore this new field that we're heading into? Curiosity seems to be an important human driver, which is not necessarily a learned association, but could be in kind of in cognitive terms the driver for creating learned associations. In the first place, you want to figure stuff out so you can fit it into kind of your overall knowledge structure. And within curiosity, there is kind of a recent body of research that kind of splits that up in diverse sensory curiosity. What was that? What happens when your phone goes ping and you want to see what's the email? And epistemic or cognitive curiosity, which is more kind of a deep level. Oh, that intrinsic motivation thing seems pretty interesting. The guy was speaking pretty fast, and I want to read some of the sources, so now I'm actually going to go and read Malone and Letter from 1997. That's going to be kind of epistemic curiosity. An interesting thing about that is that studies in computer games have there's been a lot of work done on engagement scale or player type scales for computer games. On one hand, kind of trait scales, and on one hand, experience scales on the other. And one of those was done, and I forgot to add the source, but if anyone wants it, it's something that I use a lot, and I can find the reference to it. But one of the things was developed kind of through a classic ethnographic principal component analysis approach. So you survey a lot of people, ask them to, in their own words, say, so what motivates you about video games? Why do you like playing video games? What's a great video game to you? And then you take the words and you feed them into a lot of people, and then you use a mathematical technique to see what kind of latent variables seem to be in there, if any of them kind of stack up, say, okay, so this seems to be one cluster of motivators, this seems to be another. And the 6 factors that I like to use kind of converge in some of the same ideas: arousal, fantasy, competition, diversion, social motives, and challenge. And what I really like about this is that it actually manages to dissociate competition and challenge, because a lot of people who work with games and contests for marketing, for instance, think that so a game is about competition. People who use a sport metaphor, but for many people it's not. And this is for like gamers like me and predominantly for the female sample. Challenge can be fine, or competition can be fine, but challenge is more motivating in itself. So those two different things, it seems. Also, interpersonal motivators: cooperation, competition, and recognition. Again, different things that are at the interpersonal level and not at the individual level. Yeah. The other theory, and this is actually the one that I usually use, mainly because the survey method that I use was based on this, says that there are different motivators as well, universal motivators, but but DC and Ryan grouped them into competence, autonomy, and relatedness motivators. So these are this is a more kind of parsimonious explanation, and what they say to the Lepper and Henderlong and Malone approaches that the things that they mention actually kind of fit into these 3 instead. And they all have statistics to show that their approach is right. So both of them seem to be kind of valid approaches to it, maybe more philosophically or theoretically grounded in the end than actually empirically. An example of why it can be important to talk about kind of the difference between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation in settings like education and game design is the crowding out effect, which basically means that if you take something that people already do for fun, say the Boy Scouts. Boy Scouts do a lot of stuff, and at some point, if given that they're not just pressured to be there by their parents, they're going to be doing it for fun. But if you start adding individual pay, either performance-based, that's usually a little more motivating, but especially sort of just general pay, I'm just going to give you $30 to go do this thing that you like for a day, then the extrinsic motivator is likely to, over time, crowd out the intrinsic motivator. So something that seems fun one moment can actually be moved into a different logic, a different economic frame of reasoning. Dan Ariely has done a lot of interesting stuff on kind of the difference between the social and the economic mode of thinking about things. So asking someone to do you a favor just out of the goodness of their heart, and asking someone to do you a favor for pay will actually result in very different kind of psychologically and motivational modes of reasoning about that. So knowing that kind of mixing intrinsic and extrinsic motives is often a very kind of difficult balancing act is relevant here. So if people say, okay, we need to motivate kids, let's just give them incentives, let's give them some extra money to come into school and to do stuff, then if you have kids who actually motivate in the first place, who would be doing it anyway in the first place, then they will start gaming the system. And I've seen this in Danish schools as well, when we kind of try to add like small games. So if you're all seated when the bell rings, then that's going to be one point. And if everyone's quiet when someone else talks, then it's going to be another point. And at some point, and this happens every time, some kid is you're going to ask kids to do something, and then a hand's going to shoot up. So how many points am I going to get for this? And you say, oh, you're not going to get any points, and the kids say, I'm not going to do it then. So adding incentive structures can be pretty detrimental to sort of the overall behavioral context. Interesting studies from behavioral economics as well, by the way, has shown that if the object of rewarding kids is not really to have them perform, but just to get them to be in the classroom and actually to engage behaviorally, then it seems to work. So incentive schemes that only address like really, really poor neighborhoods where kids have a great amount of truancy, and when they're at school they generally do all other kinds of things, when it's very behaviorally oriented, then those kinds of incentives actually do seem to work. But that's not because the pay creates learning, that's more because the pay creates being there, looking at your book at the end. So the experimental logic, or kind of the empirical logic that I've been working within and that I'm talking about today is kind of the idea that you have different conditions. Either you have it before or after. You have different experimental, pseudo-experimental, field experimental conditions where the extrinsic motive is constant. So you pay everyone to be part of it in the first place, or you ask students to volunteer in the first place. So the idea is basically everyone is there for the same extrinsic reasons in the first place. And then you introduce independent variables that influence intrinsic motivation in theory, like game mechanics, for instance. And then you gauge changes to y. And y can then be different measures of motivation or different behavioral measures. And that's kind of my point here today. So on one hand, you have the false finish method, which I really like because it's very neat. And by doing this false finish thing, you usually you have a good chance of removing the rest of the extrinsic motivators. Because even if there are demand characteristics, this is something that most experimenters know, that if you ask people to come and do a task, one of the reasons they do it is just kind of to please you, or to kind of do well, because they're in the lab and you're a real person and they're doing something for you. So the task will demand something of them that will motivate them in an intrinsic fashion. But if you kind of take that away and say, you don't have to do anything for me, I don't care, I'm just going to leave. In one of the studies that we did, we actually left out magazines and stuff to make it abundantly clear that they had to make sure that they could do something else if they wanted to. Then hopefully more of the extrinsic motivators are taken out of the pictures. And then you can look at different behavioral measures. And time on task is kind of the classical one. And in learning research, the more cognitive it gets, the more kind of the classic answer is that time on task leads to learning. The more time you spend on something, if you're actually cognitively engaged in the thing, then the more you're gonna learn. And the more time you spend on task, the better chance that you'll get cognitively engaged in it at some point, or you lose your engagement, whatever. So, but time on task seems to be important. But anything that kind of can be counted or taken as an indication of being on task can be used in this setting. So eye training, for instance, is something that we use now just to see, so are they looking at the screen at all? Is something going? Recordings from computer screens is pretty useful too, because you can see what are they actually doing. You can have a student who's training in code whether they're doing stuff on task or doing stuff off task. So that's usually pretty useful. And then we have inventories, and this is just like a basic tool. We've heard a few things about kind of using psychometrics, and I've been using different methods to develop my own scales for different purposes in the past couple of years. But in general, my experience is that if there is something that you want to measure, then there's probably going to be a scale out there in the first place. And if that scale is validated mathematically, and if it's been through the publication process and through kind of the conversation that goes on by being used in different kinds of settings and being used by different people who might be critical of it, then there's a better chance of on one hand of being published in the first place, because people say, okay, intrinsic motivation, we know what that is. I can vouch for that measure because I used it myself. So when I'm when I'm a reviewer, if people show me a scale that I know and that I've used, I tend to be more favorable to that, towards that, than to something that they say we developed this for the occasion, or we came up with these 3 questions that we think are important. So the intrinsic motivation inventory I kind of like because it has different motivators in it. So it has kind of the interest enjoyment scale. This is usually what I use mostly. And it's what I call a modular inventory, so you can use the ones that you want, and you can, and according to the self-determination theory, the intrinsic motivation people, you can actually also get rid of items as you like to keep the ones that fit your task best. And I'd say sure, do that, but do at least confirmatory factor analysis. At least figure out whether you're getting rid of some of the glue that holds the scale together that might be most indicative of the major variable in there. And it also has other skills like perceived competence. I was pretty good at this activity. Perceived choice. And this might actually be a reverse measure of extrinsic motivation. I felt that I had a choice doing this task. If people say I didn't have a choice, then extrinsic motivators are going to be pretty salient as well. And they're not necessarily mutually exclusive. They can be, but they don't have to be. Relatedness, effort, importance. How hard did they actually try? I usually don't use that one because it doesn't often add a lot. Pressure, tension. How difficult was this? Value, usefulness. How useful was this for some practical context? And this can be it's useful for me, I'm learning things, or it can be it's useful for the experimenter because he's learning things. So value, usefulness measure can be different things. So I'm not going to talk more about this, but since we have some students and some people who are kind of looking for materials, I think it's very nice to just see kind of what's in the box in this instance. Another measure that we're using right now, a problem that we have, is that I'm asked to do a lot of school research. I'm actually not a child researcher. I'm not a developmental psychologist, and I'm not. And in my new job, I've been asked to focus much more on adult play and adult learning processes. But a lot of kind of learning research goes on in schools. So I've been asked to find stuff that works with kids, and Rich Ryan helped me find this one, who was done by Linda, and I cannot pronounce her name because she's Dutch. But she did created this measurement that's validated for children. It's called the CPLOC, or the Children's Perceived Locus of Control or Causality Scale, and it has like 5 subscales, and we just used it a couple of times. And my experience with this one is that it actually I validated it against the main intrinsic motivation measure, and it actually correlates very well. So this short intrinsic motivation scale, which has 3 items in it, is pretty valid for measuring stuff in kids compared to the longer one that I just showed you. It also has identified regulation and internalized regulation, which is doing things for the perceived value. So this kind of, the value and usefulness, or the internalized version of that. And the internalized regulation, which is when you've been subjected to so many extrinsic motivators that they kind of become part of you. So I'm doing this because so others will think that I'm good, or otherwise I feel guilty. So that's kind of the idea of these kind of internalized extrinsic motivators. Then you have completely external regulation due to proximate outer factors, because otherwise I'll get in trouble, because those are the rules, and that's going to be consequences if I don't follow the rules. And amotivation, which is really interesting to me. I didn't really get what that was about when we started using the scale, but we decided to use the whole thing. But it's about doing things for no perceived reason at all. But I don't know why, but I think it's a waste of time, because kids often do that. I think we all kind of do that as part of grander practice settings. That you just kind of go along and say, okay, we'll see where this goes, but I don't really know why I'm doing it, or this kind of, I'm going to disengage for a little while. And one interesting thing that we found in the intervention where we used it, which is about introducing commercial over-the-counter games in classrooms to help people learn math, and to help kids learn math, and to help kids learn literature literacy, you'd say. So in the literature side, the Danish thing, the kids will use games as, instead of novels or instead of short stories, for analysis. So what's the story in the game? Who are the protagonists? Stuff like that. In a game, the protagonists and the opponents are often much more clearly defined than you'd find in kind of more ambiguous models and stuff like that. So that's one of the ideas I didn't develop the intervention. The math thing I like much more because many kids, the reason why most kids disengage from math, apart from the fact that they don't get the support that they need at home, is that they have a hard time figuring out what it's really about, what it's really for. Why are we learning these equations? Why are we doing these different kinds of calculations now? But in games, you, for example, use a lot of percentages and you use a lot of probability calculations to see how many healing potions should I bring into this dungeon. How much of my money can I use to buy other cool stuff, and how much do I need for healing potions? If you use games for something like that, then you actually give kids a context where they can start to use math for something that matters, that's immediately useful for them. And what we found, and this is just why I'm telling you a little bit about it, is that even though it's very different from classroom to classroom what happens. This is always the case in school research. Usually the main indicator of effect will be the teacher and the classroom practicing kind of the personality of the classroom as a whole, more than any single intervention. But in this case, what we found is that one of the kind of robust results is that even though the other motivators don't necessarily rise in relation to the subjects that they're being that the games are being used for, a motivation drops away. So even though they don't feel more extrinsically motivated, and they don't necessarily find math more fun, at least it lessens the sense of I'm doing this, but I have no clue why I'm doing it. So getting rid of a motivation could actually, I think, be a pretty important reason to do stuff that's engaging in the first place, even if you can't show fun as the necessary outcome. And another thing that we're doing with Sasha Barab and Anna Ritchie from Arizona State University at the moment is importing some games into Danish teachers' education. And one of the things that we find is that they don't really find it funny, and they really don't find it useful. And that's and when you do your ethnography, you realize that the reason why they don't find it useful is because they're used to being taught in a certain way. So if you introduce something that looks like a waste of time, it looks like gaming, it looks like something that you're used to conceptualizing as something that's not useful, then they're kind of going to react to it and say, no, but this feels like a waste of time to me. And they didn't really find it fun because these games that we use, they're very well designed by some very professional research, people with some very strong resources behind them at a professional game studio. But compared to other games that look like that, they're not good games. They're pretty boring, actually. So even though you don't find strong outputs in kind of, this is useful to me and this is fun, you find a very strong indication that the subject matter that the students experience within the game. They say at the beginning, I don't know much about these. In this case, it's lesson planning, classroom management, investment, and checking for understanding, which is something that's borrowed from kind of more cognitive American learning sciences. And Danish students will say, okay, we kind of know what lesson planning and classroom management is. The other stuff we don't know what is. And they might be interested in learning about it, they might not be. But after going through the experience, they realize that they know something, and they think that they learned something, but what really changes is actually their willingness to learn about these things, because they realize, so, okay, so this seems to be something that's important, so checking for understanding seems to be a very important skill to have as a teacher, because if you are unable to kind of read the minds of students or gauge their place in the learning trajectory, then it's going to be very hard to adapt your teaching, the support that you give students to the troubles that they have, the challenges that they need at any given moment. This is actually kind of basically the conclusion of John Hattie's big meta-analysis of every education intervention ever. So even though motivation doesn't change, the interest in learning something in the future changes. So games can have a transformative potential, as Sasha Barab would say, instead, even though they're not creating fun or motivation in the moment. So that's kind of one of the main payoffs that I want to bring to the table. And then, so this was kind of my overall kind of pragmatic storytelling approach to telling you about sort of the, on one hand, intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, and on the other hand, ways of measuring it. And I'm just going to show you one more study, kind of the one that we're working on right now. So I'm just going to do like a work in progress presentation of that. I'm doing with Anne Fiscali and Jacob Scherchen, and it was a research intern at the IMC this year, and Jakob is professor in physics. And what we're trying to do at the physics department at one of the other departments that I'm affiliated with is that we're trying to build a quantum computer. And this is like a really tricky technical thing that I can sometimes explain like at a rudimentary level, but basically the idea is that instead of having ones and zeros, which basically means its power is turned off or on in a bit, the bit is flipped in one way, you have quantum state atoms which can both be energy and matter at the same time. So you have more probability options to work with in a quantum computer than you do in just on or off bits. So the problem with doing something like that is that you need to move those atoms around. You need to move them into a space where they mean something in the computation. And to do that, Jacob and his guys created a game, which was why they brought me in a little bit down the line. Because they figured they had some AI algorithms working on moving around these quantum atoms in quantum space. And one of the problems with that is that it's all about probability. You don't actually know where the atom is at any given point. And if you, and the way you do it is that you freeze down the atoms to a very, very low Celsius degree, and then you use a laser to attract them, and then you move the laser and hope that the atoms kind of go along with the laser. But if the laser is jiggles in any way, then the atoms are likely to jump off, and the laser has to kind of move in different ways to move an atom from one place to another. And that's something that's a huge problem to some of the algorithms that we have, that moving through a complex space like this isn't actually a very complex space if you look at this game. But if you're an algorithm and you're told move this atom there, then you're going to try to go through a straight line, boink, and then you're going to hit that one. And if anyone ever played a game like Baldur's Gate, for instance, or any kind of early computer games which have many kind of sprites and NPCs moving about the screen, you'll know that AIs are usually not very good at moving around obstacles. So what they'll do is that they'll just kind of hit the wall again and again, move back a little bit and hit the wall again and again. And this is what some of the best algorithms do in this case. They just kind of start hitting the wall, and then at some point they're going to go, oh, this is futile, and they're going to start again. So moving around obstacles is really a big problem for very, very small and smart computers. But for human beings who can actually create a global representation of the problem space, it's a whole different problem, because we say, okay, so I guess I need to go down, and then I need to go over, and then I need to go up, and then I'm going to hit the goal space. So that's basically what the game is about. So you'll grab the atom, and then you're going to try to move it, and as you can see, that slouches a little bit. It's like moving water about, and you have to move it up and around and into the goal state. This is a very skilled player. Usually a lot of that green stuff is going to slosh around and going to go up here and get lost. So what is going on, what we're using this for in a citizen science setting, is that we try to have a lot of people all over the world play this game. It's called Quantum Moves. And the more people play the game, the more trajectories through the space we can lock. And then we can feed those into the computer algorithms, which are very precise, and they're very good at not losing the atom. And then they can kind of fine-tune what it is that the humans have already done, so we call this hybrid optimization. So basically we have human minds who are that are good at one thing, working together with proton algorithms which are good at another thing, and then we can hopefully get the best of both worlds. But getting people to play this game is another matter, because we've tried it a lot of different ways. We've had students play it, and we've just demonstrated it in conferences and science fairs and stuff like that. And there's always someone playing, and usually you find like 2 or 3 or 5 or 10 or 50 people will play the game for a few days afterwards. And that's kind of the thing that you'd expect from any game launch. Even the best game on the App Store will see, like, if there's not enough marketing behind it, you'll see, okay, a bunch of activity, and then it kind of goes away. And the only way to keep that going is to either have players act as ambassadors. That's what the best social media games do. They use players to recruit other players and to keep other players at the fire. Or you put more marketing money into the whole thing, which is what they also do. So it's not a question of not doing marketing. It's about how much marketing budget do you need to actually make money in a city like this. But we don't have that kind of money. So on one hand, we know that a lot of people, our research shows that a lot of people are doing this due to intrinsic motivation. They do this because they think it's interesting. And they do this because they genuinely like the idea of helping scientists. They like the idea of being part of that problem-solving process. And it's the same thing for other citizen science games like Folded and other stuff. We just published the first results in Nature like a month ago, I think. So that was a big win for us. But one of the challenges that we're working with is that, so how much games should we put into this to make the game good? Because on one hand we can use sort of extrinsic motivators. You have to go to the course, and during the course you will play the game. So we can get some people to play the game. We can use, and then there are some like surface intrinsic motivators. So you're going to help us. It's going to be awesome. You're going to be part of science. That helps some people going. But how do we make the game as good as possible for something like this to keep people motivated in long sense? And one of the main things that computer games research tells us is that participants need nice graphics. It needs to look pretty good, or it needs to fit well within the expectations at least. So you can have some very ugly games that still have an aesthetic of their own because they're built around kind of an 8-bit aesthetic that fits what people were playing when in the 80s or something like that. But what the sort of really successful games do is they have like really nice positive stories, and then they have what's called juicy feedback. So you're going to be told all the time, how are you doing? You're doing well, this is great, you go on. And oftentimes in our game we have people play levels that don't really help us with science, but they still give people an experience of either trying new things out or just getting them good feedback. Oh wow, this was good, you're learning now, this is awesome. So if you ever play the game, don't tell anyone this, camera high. Only a couple of the levels in the game is actually going to be used for any actual science. But it's important to figure out, so what kind of feedback should we put into that game? What kind of incentive structures should we put into sort of the overall metagame that happens from level to level and into each level to make this work well? So we tried some different things, and one of the things, yeah, of course the reason why they do is that they want you to take out your wallet and buy some real stuff. So we created a version of this game, which is actually what's called an infinite runner. It's based on games like Subway Surfer, which is a Danish, big Danish success. And in this game, you basically do the same thing. You grab an atom up here, and then you try to move it into a target area that will kind of move around. But the things that makes the game go on is that you have this little robot guy, and you fly him through the space, and you have to keep his energy level up by doing this in a good way. So if you're doing it well, then the robot guy will keep flying and you'll get more points. If at some point you lose your energy, then you're gonna go game over. And one of the things that we were interested in, so how important is this? I mean, we're pretty sure that it is important to have like a framing story and some nice gameplay that will get people to engage, but no one really bothers to test this because it's so intuitive. It's kind of just ingrained wisdom in the whole game design field. So we decided to, on one hand, we have this, and this is the kind of some of the juicy feedback that's in the game. So when the target is very active, it's going to start glowing, and you're gonna and it's going to say boost down there if you hit the target at the right time. So on one hand we have kind of the graphically nice thing, and then we have the exact same gameplay without the little robot guy, without the experience of traveling through space, and this is actually the confounder that we're considering doing a third group for. You don't have the energy bar as a distraction, because basically all it tells you is that you're going to die pretty soon. It's not really important to the actual task of moving stuff to the target area. So we did some eye tracking work to, on one hand, find out whether the different nice graphics would be distracting, whether people spend a lot of fixations working on the actual on the graphics, whether those were more distracting than helpful, or whether they were nice, juicy feedback that will help people be motivated and learn how to play the game well. And on the other hand, just how motivating the difference was. So there are two studies in there. And what we found, again, is that intrinsic motivation wasn't really any different in the two groups. Even no matter how much nice graphics we piled on this, and this is actually a pretty well done game design, it didn't really seem to shift intrinsic motivation, but behavior was very different. And as you can see in the script game, there's also a huge amount of variance or error there. So a lot of people played a lot more, and a lot of people played a lot less, but there was much more variance in the game where you're just doing it for the kind of the task and for the actual gameplay. And we did the exact same thing as we did in the first step. That's just to show you how to apply some different settings. On one hand, we did it with, so we did the false finish thing, except that we programmed that into the game, that at some point the game is going to stop and it's going to say, oh, we just need to ask you a couple of questions, and then at some point the experiment is going to go get you, and then it just, without any explanation, went back to the game, and they and then a lot of them would just like spontaneously go back. And we even told them, we even had a box on the table, and we told them, take your cell phone out of your pocket, put it in the box, do not turn it off, put it on silent, non-vibrate mode. So we were sure that they'd actually have access to the outside world, one of the main distractions that we had. We had New Scientist magazines at the table, so we were pretty sure that we offered them other things to do. And I don't remember the exact text, but it was something like, you can do whatever you want, we're going to pick you up as soon as we're ready for you, or something like that. And then we waited, and that gave us the behavior result that you see there. So that's a way of seeing that, on one hand, even though fun, or kind of the basic idea of being motivated, or this was a great experience, doesn't seem to enter into it, other factors seem to do. So oftentimes in situations like this, what you find out is that when the people we work with say, can you help us measure fun, or can you help us measure motivation, we say, sure, we can do that, but that's probably not the measure that you need to understand what really goes on in your game. It's going to, or in your design. It might help you figure out kind of some experiential differences, but it might not be kind of the main measure that's going to really help you enhance your design. What we find using a scale that I'm not going to bore you with, that was derived from the IMI by Rich Ryan and Scott Rigby for game design purposes, was that the feeling of competence was actually important to whether or not people would drop out, would stop playing, would not play the game anymore. So people who responded that they felt a certain amount of competence, they would be willing to go on. But the people who were kind of on the low end of the competence scale, in this group, in the non-flash group, they would drop out, but the correlation was not significant, not strong in the other group. So it seems that if you have something that kind of keeps you going, kind of a narrative, and you have the feeling of competence, I'm actually doing pretty well, then that's going to be fine. But over here, since you don't have anything else driving, you don't have kind of the juicy feedback and visual support for your experience, it seems that the task itself, the feeling of competence, becomes much more important. If you don't feel that you're doing good at it, then you're going to stop at some point. So those are some preliminary results, and we're going to do more calculations on those, and we're going to add kind of studies of the scores, the actual points that they managed to accrue, and the eye tracking data as well. So that's kind of something that we're going to do in the fall, and then we're going to implement that into the design. So I always like that when you start doing research and you end up with John Dewey, then you probably did something right. So this is what happened to me. So my philosophy at the moment is that motivation is super important, and the experience of being engaged and being and having fun is very important, and that does not necessarily need to translate into behavior. Just creating the experience of having fun is, in my book at least, creating value at a human level. So I'd always encourage people to do that in their designs. But intrinsic motivation is not a magic bullet for all behavioral needs. Sometimes more subtle motivational factors or more subtle elements in the design are going to be more important than just the feeling of having fun. So fun, like Dewey would say, is not necessarily going to get you anywhere if it doesn't get you somewhere where you're challenged, where you're being challenged to figure out things that are actually useful and important to you, to engage in inquiry and go into a mode of problem solving that you wouldn't have been in otherwise. So many of the learning games that were pretty bad in the 80s and 90s just kind of managed to hold students in kind of suspended fun animation without really supplying the learning opportunities that they needed to move beyond the sort of proximal development. Just a few pragmatic challenges. I've been talking for almost an hour now. Is that we need to ask ourselves, is subjective motivation really relevant? Is it really the main concern? And if not, then how do we also measure the things that we're really interested in? If intrinsic motivation in itself is the main cause of your interest, then fine. But if it's a proxy of something else, then also figure out what that something else is. And how salient the extrinsic motive is going to be, like demand characteristics, and how can we deal with that? The false finish approach is something that might help with that, but it's definitely not kind of the magic bullet that will just solve that problem for you. And then, as I mentioned in the game study, the first one that we had, with the quantum game, people are just playing at a screen all by their lonesome in the lab. So that, or in a meeting room set up to be lab actually. So they're on their own. But in the first study, people are playing together. So even though we got some behavioral results, those were very much at the table level. So if you got a good game, Or if one of you really insisted on keeping playing, then the other people might just humor that person without really being too engaged in the first place. So many of the behavioral effects that we found, I think, and we didn't collect good ethnographic data, and that's actually one of the reasons why I really strongly recommend getting some good video observations and doing some mixed methods research and really taking mixed methods seriously in any kind of work, taking the human experience and kind of the practical dynamics in the room into consideration when doing things like this. So the behavioral data in that study probably aren't really any good because those were at the table level. We tried to tease that out by doing multi-level analysis, but with so small samples that like the ones we had like 90 people, multi-level modeling isn't really all that stable, so it didn't help us all that much. And then finally, this is just another pragmatic reflection using multi-scale instruments like the C-plug. You need to have like really strong a priori hypotheses about what you expect to come out of each scale. If you're just doing like exploratory stuff, then it's fine, then it's okay. But if you want to find an effect, if you're trying to figure out whether an intervention in the classroom or in the lab is going to make a difference, then unless you're just doing p-fishing, unless you just want as many chances to get a significant result as you can, then have an a priori idea about what you're measuring. At the moment, I usually see, so we have one behavior measure, and we have one self-report measure that are the important ones, and then we kind of have a hierarchy of sub-hypotheses. But all these other things might be moderators, or they might be other interesting things, but they're not sort of the main question that we're asking. So you have like a nice answer to put into the paper that you publish, or to the report that you write to the people funding the game design or whatever. So just having those a priori sorting methods can be really important. And of course, if you can get the data out of the system in some way, instead of having to time people with a stopwatch, if you can see what they're doing on the screen, we did a field experiment recently with some gamification and nudging and rational information to see if we can move people from cars to buses in their commuting in the morning. We could actually measure how many times they use the Danish travel card. So every single user, we were able to see how many times that they do the thing that we wanted them to do, which is much, much more nice than having them do subjective measures, on one hand self-reports, because those are always kind of subject to a lot of problems, and there are statistical arguments why you can kind of put on a helmet and say we accept those risks. But especially also just having to observe and time people and code stuff. If you can get like an automatic way of gathering those kind of real life data, especially if you do field experiments and classroom experiments, then that's going to be very time saving, and it's going to be a very nicer and more easy story to tell in the end. Especially if you're working with people who are not researchers, but who just want to see, does this thing that we're doing have an effect, does it work? So, that's it. You want, just have to talk.